You handed back some cash to look good for the cameras, and now you're sitting at my table like you earned it? You didn't earn anything. I built 11 years in this company. Do you know how many people like you I've watched walk through this building? You clean the floor, you get one lucky break, and suddenly you think that makes you somebody. It doesn't, and it never will.
She placed the envelope on the marble reception desk at 1:14 in the morning. $500,000 in cash. She did not leave a name. She did not wait to be seen. She straightened the edges against the marble, turned and walked back toward the service corridor, her uniform still smelling like floor cleaner and the dust behind the vents on the 8th floor. She did not know two things. She did not know that the man who owned the building had been watching her from the mezzanine for 11 minutes and had seen her count that money twice with hands that would not stop shaking. And she did not know that in 9 days, a woman 2 floors above her, a woman who smiled at her every morning in the elevator and never once learned a name, was going to look at a spreadsheet, do some quiet arithmetic and decide that Amara Reeves needed to disappear. Not killed. Nothing so clean as that. Just erased, career gone, children gone. Name turned into a rumor nobody wanted to be caught repeating. Vanessa Kirby Cole had been stealing from Whitfield Logistics for 2 years, one falsified invoice at a time, and she had gotten very good at making sure nobody looked too closely at the numbers. Amara Reeves had just given her a reason to worry that somebody finally would. Vanessa was smart enough to know she couldn't just make Amara disappear. She was smart enough to know exactly what would work instead. Something quieter. Something that would look, on paper, like nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence involving an overworked single mother and a system already primed to doubt her. This is the story of 9 days. What Amara did with the money is the easy part. What Vanessa did to make her pay for it is the part that should scare you. Stay with me. Her name was Amara Josephine Reeves, 31 years old, night custodial staff, Whitfield Logistics headquarters, downtown Atlanta. She had been on the 8th floor rotation for 3 years. She rented the bottom unit of a duplex on Boulevard in the old 4th Ward, 3 blocks from the house her grandmother had bought for $11,000 in 1966. And that a developer now wanted to buy from the current owner for $600,000 so he could put in a rooftop bar. She had 2 children. Nia was 9, Kai was 5. Kai had a developmental speech delay. The pediatrician had said the words at his 3-year checkup, and Amara had carried them ever since like a stone lodged somewhere behind her sternum. He needed speech therapy. Everybody agreed on that. The Medicaid waitlist did not agree on when. She had been on it for 14 months. Nobody had called. So she built her own program. Library books, index cards taped to the refrigerator. A list she updated every Sunday, speech words of the week. Every night before her shift, she sat with Kai and pointed at the cards and waited. He tried. When he couldn't say it, he drew it. A yellow circle for the moon, a stick figure for his sister, rain for the days that were hard. She worked 5 fat nights a week. She got home at 6:25 in the morning. Nia had learned to pour her own cereal without waking her, because the alternative was dragging a chair across the kitchen floor, and Nia had decided, at some point nobody had marked on a calendar, that her mother's sleep was worth more than her own convenience. Amara did not know on the Thursday night she found the envelope that this was the last ordinary week her family would have for a long time. The executive lounge on the 8th floor was the last room on her rotation. Leather chairs, a coffee machine that cost more than her monthly rent, a steel trash can she had emptied every Thursday for 3 years, usually full of espresso pods, and the sandwich wrappers of people who could afford to leave half a lunch behind. Tonight it held a manila envelope unsealed, no name. She almost dropped it into the trash bag with everything else. It was heavy. She opened it, $100 bills, banded in stacks. She counted once. She counted again. Her hands were not steady on the second count. $500,000. She sat down in one of the leather chairs she was not supposed to sit in, and she thought about Kai's waitlist. She thought about Nia's shoes, a half size too small, unmentioned, because Nia had learned not to mention things like that. She thought about her brother Terrell, 200 miles away in a state facility, and the $40 she sent his commissary account every month by skipping lunch 3 days a week. $500,000 was not a number her life had ever contained, not as salary, not as hope. She held it for 11 minutes. Then she put it back in the envelope, walked it down to the lobby, and set it on the reception desk with a note in her own handwriting. Found in executive lounge, Thursday night shift. She did not sign it. She clocked out at 1:15 a.m. She did not know that the money had been placed there on purpose. A test, the third of 3 envelopes Marcus Whitfield had left around his building that week to see what his 400 employees did when they believed no one was watching. She did not know that the other 2 envelopes had vanished without a word. She did not know that hers was about to be seen by someone whose entire career was built on nobody looking too closely at anything. Marcus Delane Whitfield built his logistics company from one rented box truck with a transmission that slipped between second and third gear. He was 23 when he started, driving the pickups himself, sleeping in the cab some nights because paying for both a room and a full tank of diesel in the same week wasn't always possible. By 30, he had a small fleet. By 45, he had a company with his name on the building downtown and a client list that included half the manufacturers in the southeast. He was 59 now, worth a number he had stopped tracking, and widowed 6 years, his wife Renata gone to pancreatic cancer in the space of a single terrible summer. Renata had been a nurse. She was working the night shift at Grady Memorial when he came in at 3 in the morning with a dislocated shoulder from loading freight too fast, 26 years old, and too proud to admit needed help until the pain made the decision for him. Set the shoulder herself, told him he was going to hurt himself worse if he kept working like that. And when he told her he didn't have a choice, she told him everyone has a choice. They just don't always like the options in front of them. She was the only person who had ever made him look down, not at spreadsheets or balance sheets, but at the actual floor someone else was cleaning, the driver waiting in the rain outside a warehouse loading dock, the woman behind the gas station register whose name he'd bought coffee from for 6 years without ever once asking. Renata saw those people because she had been one of them. She made him see them too, not through lectures, just through the plain fact of being beside him in a way that made invisibility impossible. When she died, that habit died with her for a long time. Nobody replaced it. His son from a previous relationship, Julian, was 29 now, worked in the competent in the narrow way people are competent when nobody has ever required more of them than that, and the relationship between father and son had settled into something professional, cordial, and quietly hollow, a distance Marcus had built without ever consciously deciding to build it. 2 years after Renata's death, an old business acquaintance had talked Marcus into funding a charitable water initiative in East Africa to the tune of $9 million. Only for federal investigators to determine 18 months later that most of the money had gone to fabricated project reports and the acquaintance's own mortgage. Marcus never recovered the money. He recovered something worse, a hardened, settled belief that had been forming in him since before the fraud, and that the fraud only confirmed. Everybody performs goodness when they think somebody's watching. The only real measure of a person is what they do with what they cannot afford to lose, when nobody's watching at all. He had started leaving the test envelopes around his building the year after that, quietly 3 or 4 times a year, never expecting much and rarely getting it. He had almost stopped doing it entirely, the night Amara Reeves returned $500,000. At 1 in the morning was, if he was honest with himself, the closest thing to hope he had felt inside that building in 6 years. A week after the incident with Marcus's water charity, he had found a letter Renata had written him from her hospital bed 4 days before she got her handwriting uneven, the pen visibly shaking across the page, but the words themselves entirely clear. "You will know them," she had written, "by what they do with what they cannot afford to lose." He had read that sentence most mornings since her funeral, a ritual more than a practice, words repeated so often they had started to become sound without weight. It had weight again now. He kept the letter folded in the same drawer as his most important contracts, which told you, if you knew him well enough to notice, exactly what he considered it to be. He had placed 3 test envelopes that week, $10,000 each, drawn from his own discretionary fund. Conference room, 12th floor. Break room, 3rd floor. Executive lounge, 8th floor. 2 vanished. The 3rd came back. except it came back with $500,000 in it, not $10,000. And that discrepancy was the first loose thread in a much larger rope. He did not know yet that the extra $490,000 belonged to nobody he had authorized. Funneled through a vendor account that did not officially exist, and that the woman managing his company's operating budget had been quietly bleeding Whitfield. Logistics dry for 2 years through invoices for consulting work that was never performed. He knew only that a woman named Amara Reeves had returned an unthinkable amount of money at 1 in the morning and had not waited around to be thanked. He had his assistant pull her personnel file. 3 years of quarterly reviews, every box checked satisfactory or above. No complaints filed, no sick days used despite being entitled to them. At the bottom of her most recent review, her supervisor had written 4 sentences. Reliable, never late, never complains, never asks for anything. Marcus read the last sentence twice. It did not describe a woman with no needs. It described a woman who had decided a long time ago that having needs out loud was not something she could afford. He drove to her building himself that Saturday. He climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled like cooking oil and knocked. Amara opened the door in a grey sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, and looked at him the way you look at something standing in the wrong place. "My name is Marcus Whitfield," he said. "I own the building you clean. You returned an envelope Thursday night. I need to understand what was in it, and I need to offer you something, and I don't think either of those things should happen standing in a doorway." She let him in. He told her about a position, operations coordinator, full benefits including a developmental services rider that covered speech therapy for dependents with no waitlist and no cap, tuition covered for a 6-month operations certificate. All of it real, all of it already sitting in his company's benefits handbook, buried on page 71, where almost nobody hourly ever read that far. "I don't take things I haven't earned," Amara said. "This isn't a gift," Marcus said. "It's an investment. There's a difference, and I think you already know it, or you wouldn't have carried $500,000 down 4 flights of stairs at 1 in the morning instead of keeping it." She told him she needed to think about it. He left his card. She did not call that night, or the next. She called on Sunday evening after her neighbor Loretta knocked on her door. "Baby, I heard you through that wall 3 nights running, doing math, out loud." Loretta stood in the doorway, arms crossed, not in any hurry to get to her point. The way people talk when they've buried 2 husbands and learned that most things worth saying can wait an extra 10 seconds. Enough now. You bring those babies to me whenever. Don't you go telling me it's too much trouble. I raised 4 of my own, 2 of somebody else's for a while too. This ain't trouble. This is just what people do. "Loretta, I can't keep asking you to..." "Didn't ask you to ask." Loretta patted the doorframe twice, the way she did when a conversation was over whether the other person agreed or not. "Bring 'em by." "This is Amara Reeves," she said into the phone. "I'll take the position." Nobody in that apartment knew that Sunday night, that 2 floors above the executive lounge, a woman named Vanessa Kirby Cole had already pulled Amara's personnel file for a very different reason. Vanessa Kirby Cole was 44 years old, vice president of operations at Whitfield Logistics, and had been the company's most trusted executive for 11 years. She had a corner office on the 30th floor. She had a smile that had been professionalized somewhere around her 2nd year of business school, and had not slipped since. She had also been stealing from Marcus Whitfield for 2 years. It had started small. A consulting invoice for a vendor that existed only on paper, $40,000, routed through an account she controlled, then another. Then a pattern she had built carefully enough that it survived 2 external audits, because Vanessa knew exactly which numbers auditors checked, and which they trusted on her signature alone. By the time Amara found the envelope in the executive lounge, Vanessa had moved just under $2 million through the phantom vendor account, most of it sitting in a brokerage account under her sister's maiden name. Vanessa had grown up in College Park, the daughter of a schoolteacher and an insurance adjuster, solidly middle class in a way that had felt to her as a teenager humiliatingly close to poor every time she compared her family's Honda to the BMW parked outside her magnet high school. She had gone to Emory on scholarships and loans, graduated with honors, and spent her 20s clawing her way into rooms where nobody's father had driven a bus or cleaned a house, telling herself the whole time that the clawing would stop mattering once she'd clawed high enough. It never stopped mattering. She made vice president at 38 and discovered that the number in her bank account, however large it got, never quite closed the gap between the person she had built herself into and the person she still felt like underneath the tailored blazers. Someone one bad quarter away from being sent back to where she started. Theft had begun. If she was honest with herself, which she rarely allowed herself to be, not out of greed exactly, but out of the same fear that had driven her since she was 15 years old and ashamed of her family's car, a cushion, an exit, a number large enough that nobody could ever again make her feel the way that BMW-lined parking lot had made her feel. 2 years and just under $2 million later, the cushion had become its own kind of prison, one she serviced with invoices and shell accounts the way another person might service a mortgage, and she had gotten so good at the mechanics of it that she had almost stopped feeling the fear that started it. Almost. She had also, 3 weeks earlier, become aware of something that frightened her more than any audit. A discrepancy report generated automatically by the warehouse routing software flagging a 40-minute scheduling gap that traced back, if anyone followed it far enough, to the same phantom vendor's shipment logs. The gap had been noticed by a night custodian who had mentioned it, almost in passing to a supervisor during a shift changeover. The custodian's name was Amara Reeves. Vanessa had buried that report once already. But now Amara Reeves was being pulled up to the 30th floor into a management training track, with Marcus Whitfield's personal attention on her file. And people on management tracks asked questions. People on management tracks got invited to the meetings where routing discrepancies got discussed out loud in rooms with more than one set of eyes. Vanessa did the math the way she did everything, quietly at her desk after hours with the door closed. Amara Reeves was now a variable she could not control. Variables that could not be controlled needed to be removed. The first move came 11 days after Amara started her new position. It arrived disguised as kindness. Vanessa stopped by the operations floor on a Tuesday afternoon, coffee in hand, and told Amara how impressed she was with her progress, how rare it was to see someone move that fast, how she personally wanted to make sure Amara had every resource she needed to succeed. She asked warmly whether Amara had access to the full training materials. She asked about her children. She asked so gently it barely registered as a question at all. Whether it was hard being a mother and doing all at once. Amara answered honestly, the way you answer someone who seems to be asking out of genuine concern. She mentioned Kai's therapy schedule. She mentioned that Loretta helped with the children some evenings. She mentioned once in passing that some nights it was just her and the kids, and that was fine, that was how it had always been. Vanessa smiled and said that sounded like a lot for one person to carry, and Amara agreed because it was true and did not think about the conversation again. 3 days later, an anonymous report was filed with the Fulton County Division of Family and Children's Services alleging that a single mother named Amara Reeves regularly left 2 young children, ages 5 and 9, unsupervised for extended hours while working night and evening shifts with an unrelated adult neighbor providing inadequate and unlicensed supervision. The report cited specific details about the children's ages, the mother's work schedule, and the neighbor's name. Details that only someone who had spoken with Amara directly could have known. A caseworker assigned to the file, a tired, overloaded woman named Denise Olivant, with a caseload triple what the county recommended, had no way of knowing the report was manufactured. She only knew that specific, detailed complaints about child welfare got investigated, because the ones that didn't were the ones that made the news for the wrong reasons. Amara found the caseworker's card wedged in her door on a Thursday morning, along with a letter stating that an investigation had been opened and that a home visit would occur within 72 hours. She stood in her kitchen holding the letter, and she did not for a long moment understand what she was looking at. Then she understood completely, and something in her chest went cold. In a way $500,000 in an envelope had never come close to doing. She called Marcus that afternoon because there was nobody else to call, and because in 3 weeks He had become the only person in the building who had ever asked her a question and actually waited for the answer. "They think I neglect my children," she said, and her voice did something she had not let it do since her mother's funeral. Marcus told her to sit down. He told her he would get her a lawyer. He told her this would be handled. What neither of them knew yet was that the same week, an internal HR complaint had also been filed against Amara, this one alleging that she had used her new access to operation systems to falsify her own timesheet during her transition period, a fabricated but carefully constructed accusation supported by 2 altered login records that Vanessa had built herself using access privileges nobody had thought to restrict from a vice president of operations. 2 attacks, 2 fronts. Both timed to land in the same week. Marcus was scheduled to leave for a 10-day supplier summit in Singapore that Vanessa herself had recommended he attend in person, insisting the relationship with the overseas manufacturing partners needed his personal touch this year. He would be 12 time zones away when it all came down. He did not know that yet either. Marcus left for Singapore on a Sunday. He called Amara from the airport, promised her the lawyer would be in touch by Monday morning, promised her this would not be allowed to stand. By Wednesday, Amara had been placed on unpaid administrative leave from Whitfield Logistics, pending the outcome of the HR investigation into her timesheets. By Thursday, the caseworker had completed her home visit, a visit during which Nia, frightened and confused, had said something about staying home a lot that got written down without the context that made it harmless, and Kai, 5 years old and still building his words one at a time, had not been able to explain anything at all, which the caseworker's report noted as a possible additional concern. By Friday, Amara sat in her kitchen with 2 letters on the table. One said her employment was suspended. One said a follow-up hearing regarding her children's welfare would be scheduled within 30 days, and that in the interim, unsupervised overnight care needed to be arranged through an approved provider, not a neighbor, per department policy. Loretta could not legally watch the children overnight anymore, not because Loretta had done anything wrong, because a policy existed, and policies did not care why they existed, only that they were followed. Amara called Marcus. The call went to voicemail. It was 2 in the morning in Singapore. She sat at her kitchen table with the refrigerator behind her, covered in Kai's drawings, the speech words of the week, a folded $20 bill in her wallet. She had never spent because her mother had given it to her the week before she died and told her to buy something that wasn't for anyone else. She had never felt more alone in her life, and she had spent 14 months on a waitlist nobody called about, and 3 years cleaning floors for people who never learned her name, and she knew what alone felt like. This was worse. This was alone with a clock running. She thought about calling Terrell, and then remembered that phone calls from a state facility cost $1 a minute, and that she had exactly $11 in her checking account until Friday, and the small, absurd cruelty of that fact that she could not even afford to hear her own brother's voice. On the one night she most needed to hear somebody tell her she wasn't losing her mind, sat on her chest heavier than almost anything else that week. Nia found her there at midnight, still at the kitchen table, and stood in the doorway in her pajamas for a long moment, before she came and sat down across from her mother without being asked. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and put her small hand flat on top of her mother's, the way Amara had done for her 100 times during thunderstorms when Nia was small enough to still be scared of them. "We're gonna be okay," Nia said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of thing a 9-year-old says when she has decided, somewhere along the way, that being the calm one in the room is simply one more job that falls to her. The way pouring her own cereal had become a job. The way not mentioning the shoes that didn't fit had become a job. Amara looked at her daughter and thought, not for the first time, that she had built something remarkable out of almost nothing, and that whatever happened next, nobody, not a caseworker, not a stranger's phone call, not a woman 2 floors above her with a smile that had never once reached her eyes, was going to convince her that this child in front of her was evidence of neglect. "We're going to be okay," she agreed, and for that moment at midnight, with $11 in her account and a hearing in 6 days, she almost believed it. Amara Josephine Reeves was born in southwest Atlanta, in a neighborhood called Adair Park, where the houses were small and close together, and everybody's grandmother knew everybody's business, which was less a curse than a kind of insurance policy nobody had to pay premiums on. Her father, Douglas Reeves, drove a MARTA bus for 22 years. Her mother, Yolanda, cleaned houses in Buckhead before she cleaned offices downtown, and she used to say there wasn't a floor in this city she hadn't gotten down on her knees for at some point, and she said it without bitterness, like it was simply a fact about the geography of her life, the way rivers are facts about the geography of a country. Douglas had one rule he repeated more than any other. He said it at the dinner table. He said it in the truck on the way to church. He said it the day 8-year-old Amara found a $10 bill on the floor of the Kroger on Cascade Road and looked up at him with the particular hope of a child who believes the universe occasionally leaves money on the ground on purpose. If it isn't yours, it isn't yours. Doesn't matter how bad you need it. Doesn't matter if nobody's looking. He walked her to customer service. She handed the $10 to a bored teenager behind the counter who looked like he had better things to do than process the moral education of an 8-year-old. Douglas didn't care what that boy's face did. He cared what his daughter's hands did, and her hands gave it back. Douglas died when Amara was 20. A heart attack behind the wheel of his bus on Cleveland Avenue, pulled over safely before it happened, which the other drivers said afterward was exactly like him, taking care of the passengers even on his way out. Yolanda held on for 3 more years, diabetes complications stacking on top of each other the way trouble does when a body has been worked too hard for too long without enough rest to recover from any of it. She died on a Tuesday in October. Amara was 23 with a 1-year-old daughter and a job at a call center that didn't pay enough to cover the funeral, so she put half of it on a credit card she was still paying off 8 years later. Her brother Terrell was 19 when their mother died. He fell in with men who offered him the 2 things grief makes a person desperate for: structure and somewhere to belong. He caught a robbery charge at 21, driving a car for men who'd promised him $50 and a friendship, and got 8 years in a state facility 200 miles from Atlanta. Amara visited when she could. She sent $40 to his commissary account every month, money she found by skipping lunch 3 days a week, a habit so old by now she barely noticed the hunger anymore. The way you stop noticing a hum in a room after you've lived in it long enough. She had Nia at 22. The father left before the birth certificate was even filed. She had Kai at 27, a different man who stayed for a while and then left the week the pediatrician said the words developmental speech delay out loud, looking at a referral list like it was a bill he hadn't agreed to co-sign. She did not go looking for either of them. She had learned the hard way that the math on chasing a man who had already decided you weren't worth staying for never once came out in her favor. So she carried it. She carried it the way her father carried a bus full of other people's mornings, and her mother carried the smell of somebody else's kitchen home at night. And her brother carried time in a place that measured his whole life in days remaining. She carried it because putting it down had never once been one of the options in front of her. And because the only other place it could land was on her children, and that was never, under any circumstances, going to happen. That was the woman who knelt down over a trash can in an executive lounge on a Thursday night and found more money than her family had ever touched in one place, and gave it back anyway, because her father's voice had been living inside her for 11 years after his funeral, and it had never once, not for one single second, gone quiet. The Monday after she started her new position, Amara sat through her first operations meeting in the same conference room she had wiped down every Thursday night for 3 years. 14 people around a table. She knew the underside of better than most of them knew the top of it. She did not speak. She took notes on a legal pad she'd bought for $1.50 at the drugstore, and she listened, and she went home and read the training materials until 1 in the morning, with Kai's nightlight glowing down the hall. By the end of her second week, she had taught herself the routing software from a library book on Excel, and a stack of free tutorials she watched on her phone during the 15 minutes she used to spend eating a sandwich standing up in a supply closet. She ate lunch sitting down now, in an actual chair, in the break room she used to empty the trash from, and some days that alone felt like the whole promotion. It was during her third week that she noticed the gap. Loading dock schedules and driver dispatch times that didn't line up. A 40-minute stretch every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, where trucks sat idle and drivers waited on paperwork that seemed to arrive from nowhere in particular. She had watched it happen from the warehouse floor for 3 years without anyone ever asking her opinion on it, because nobody asks the woman with the mop what she's noticed about the schedule. She mentioned it, almost as an aside, to her supervisor during a shift changeover. The way you mention something you assume everybody with the actual authority to fix it must already know. Her supervisor mentioned it up the chain. It landed, eventually and without much ceremony, on a routing discrepancy report that auto-generated every quarter, and that almost nobody read past the summary page. Nobody. What Amara did not know, what nobody but Vanessa Kirby-Cole knew, was that the caseworker's supervisor had also received an anonymous tip that week, one urging a faster timeline given prior concerns or reg, a phrase that made the case appear to have a documented history it did not actually have, and which pushed the 30-day hearing window down to 9 days. Vanessa was not sloppy. She had learned across 2 years of careful theft that the difference between getting caught and getting away with everything was patience and paperwork. She built Amara's downfall with the same tools she'd used to build her own fraud. A form here, a call there, small pressures applied by people who had no idea they were being used, each one convinced they were simply doing their job correctly. She did not hate Amara Reeves. She barely thought of her as a person at all. Amara was a variable, and variables got solved for. She'd kept the fraud invisible through 2 external audits by exploiting something simple. Auditors sampled vendor payments above a certain dollar threshold and below a certain frequency, flagging anything that looked statistically unusual. Vanessa split her phantom invoices into amounts just under the sampling threshold, spread across a rotating cast of shell vendor names she retired and replaced every few months. And, because she was the one who signed off on both the vendor approval and the payment release, nobody else's signature ever appeared anywhere near the transactions to raise a second set of eyebrows. The system trusted her because the system was built to trust the person one level below the top of it, and nobody had thought to ask what happened if that person decided not to be trustworthy. Devontae Marsh was 19 years old and worked the front desk security rotation at Whitfield Logistics 3 nights a week, while he finished his associate's degree in criminal justice at Georgia State. He liked Amara. Everybody on the night crew liked Amara because she remembered everyone's names and asked about their families, and once brought him a plate of her grandmother's peach cobbler recipe because he'd mentioned once that he missed his grandmother's cooking. He had grown up in Riverdale with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who wasn't around, and he had decided early, watching his mother come home exhausted from a hospital laundry shift more nights than not, that he wanted to do work that actually protected people like her, which was most of the reason he'd chosen criminal justice over the business degree his high school counselor kept pushing on him. He was good at his job in the quiet, careful way that people are good at jobs they actually care about, rather than jobs they're only doing to get somewhere else. He noticed things. He wrote them down. He had a logbook he kept for himself, separate from the official incident reports, full of small details that never seemed important at the time, and that he'd learned from watching enough true crime documentaries, with his mother on her nights off, sometimes turned out to matter more than anybody expected. Devontae had also 8 months earlier been asked by Vanessa Kirby-Cole's assistant to grant temporary badge access to the executive lounge and the 8th floor server closet for Werner maintenance, a request that had seemed unremarkable at the time and that he had logged dutifully exactly the way security protocol required. When word moved through the building, and it always moved, because 400 people cannot keep 400 secrets, that Amara had been accused of falsifying her own login records, Devontae remembered the vendor maintenance request. He remembered the date. He remembered that the Vanna badge used that night had been issued under a contractor name that, when he actually looked it up, out of nothing but a bad feeling, did not correspond to any company Whitfield Logistics had a contract with. He did not know what it meant. He knew it was strange. He knew Amara was in trouble, and he knew he had a log entry that did not add up, and he was 19 years old and did not know exactly what to do with that. So he did the only thing that felt right. He called Ruiz. Not a private investigator this time. Tomas Ruiz, an old family friend of his mother's who had spent 20 years in corporate fraud investigation before retiring into part-time consulting work. The kind of man every extended black family in Atlanta seemed to have exactly one of. Somebody who had left a government job with a pension and a phone that still rang whenever somebody's nephew got into trouble they didn't understand. Ruiz listened to Devontae for 11 minutes without interrupting. Then he asked one question. You said this badge access was requested by Kirby Cole's office. You have the ticket number? Yes, sir. Don't do anything else. Don't tell anyone else. Send me that ticket number and don't touch it again. Devontae sent it. Ruiz called Marcus Whitfield's private cell phone in Singapore at 3 in the morning Atlanta time, which was 4 in the afternoon, where Marcus was sitting in a supplier meeting. He could not remember a single detail of afterward. Mr. Whitfield, you don't know me. My name is Tomas Ruiz. I think somebody in your company just tried to frame an innocent woman to cover up something a lot bigger than $500,000, and I think you have about 5 days to stop it. Marcus flew home early. He landed in Atlanta on Tuesday morning, 4 hours before the scheduled family court hearing, and he went straight from the airport to the office of a forensic accountant named Priya Chandrasekaran, whose firm he had used twice before for supplier due diligence, and who he trusted the way he trusted almost no one. He gave her everything Ruiz had pulled together in 3 days: the vendor badge ticket, the Phantom Consulting Company name, and, because Ruiz had not stopped there, a list of 6 other vendor invoices over 2 years that trace back to accounts controlled by the same shell entity, all of them approved by a single signature, Vanessa Kirby Cole's signature. Priya worked through the night. By Wednesday morning, she had traced just under $2 million in fraudulent payments, a shell vendor registered to an address that turned out to be a UPS mailbox in Marietta, and a brokerage account under the maiden name of Vanessa's sister that had received 11 wire transfers matching almost to the dollar the fraudulent invoice amounts. She had also found something else. A login timestamp from the night. The vendor maintenance badge was used in the executive lounge, cross-referenced against the building's keycard system. The badge had granted access to the server closet adjoining the operations floor at 11:52 p.m., 19 minutes before 2 specific timesheet entries under Amara Reeves's employee ID were digitally altered. The badge had been used by someone standing at Vanessa Kirby Cole's own desk terminal, based on the network log's originating IP address. She had not even bothered to disguise it well. She had never expected anyone to look. Wednesday afternoon, before any of it had gone public, Vanessa found Amara alone in the break room on the operations floor, pouring coffee with hands that had not entirely stopped shaking in 9 days. Vanessa had not planned the encounter. She told herself, walking toward the break room with her own coffee cup as an excuse, that she only wanted to gauge what Amara knew, whether the girl suspected anything, whether there was still time to manage the situation the way she had managed every situation for 2 years. You look tired, Vanessa said, warm as ever, the professionalized smile sliding easily into place. This whole thing with the county must be exhausting for you. I hope it resolves quickly. Amara looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face had changed in 9 days, not harder exactly, but sharper. The softness of exhaustion burned away into something more like focus. You knew about Loretta, Amara said quietly. The report knew her name, knew Kai's age, knew Nia's age, knew my schedule down to the day. I told you those things, in this room, 3 weeks ago. Vanessa's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes flickered, the way a light flickers right before it goes out for good. I'm sure a lot of people knew your schedule, Amara. You're not exactly private about your family. I never said Loretta's last name to anyone else in this building, Amara said. Not once, not to HR, not to my supervisor. I said it to you, standing right here 3 weeks ago, because you asked me how I managed, and I thought you were asking because you cared. The break room was empty, except for the 2 of them and the hum of the refrigerator. Vanessa set her coffee cup down on the counter with more care than the motion required. I don't know what you think happened, Vanessa said, But I'd be careful about the kinds of accusations you make against people with a lot more standing in this company than you have. I'm not accusing you of anything, Amara said, and for the first time in the conversation her voice was completely steady. I'm just telling you what I know, and I know a lot more about how this building actually runs than anybody upstairs ever gave me credit for. 3 years of cleaning floors teaches you things nobody thinks to hide from the woman with the mop. She picked up her coffee and walked out, and Vanessa stood alone in the break room. For a long moment, her hands finally visibly, no longer steady at all. On the Saturday before the hearing, Vanessa allowed herself, for the first time, a small private moment of confidence. She sat in her home office in Buckhead with a glass of wine and looked at the case timeline she had engineered and thought, "This is over. In 9 days it will be over, and Marcus will come home from Singapore to find his little charity project unemployed, under investigation, and unable to prove any of it traced back to me, because none of it does. Not on paper, not anywhere anyone would think to look." She was almost right. She had made exactly one mistake, and it was small, and it was the kind of mistake made by someone who had never once, in 2 years of careful theft, imagined that the person she was stepping on might look up and might remember, word for word, exactly what she had been told and by whom. The family court hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the morning. Marcus's lawyer, a family law specialist named Adrian Boudreau, who Ruiz had recommended and who had spent her career representing parents against exactly this kind of manufactured neglect claim, filed an emergency motion Wednesday evening requesting the hearing be delayed 24 hours pending submission of new evidence relevant to the credibility of the original complaint. The motion was granted. On Thursday morning, instead of a family court hearing, there was a meeting in the Whitfield Logistics 30th floor boardroom. Marcus had called it himself, framed publicly as an emergency review of recent irregularities in vendor management, and every member of the executive team had been required to attend, including Vanessa Kirby Cole. Amara was there too. Marcus had asked her to come, and she had almost said no, because she did not see what a boardroom of executives had to do with a caseworker's report about her children, and because she was exhausted in a way that had nothing left in it for performing composure in front of strangers in suits. "You don't have to say a single word in that room," Marcus told her on the phone. "You just have to be in it. She needs to see your face when this happens. Because for the rest of her life, she is going to know exactly whose face was in the room when it fell apart." Amara wore the navy dress she had bought for her operations certificate ceremony. She put on lipstick for the first time in 9 days. She sat down at the far end of the long table, and Vanessa Kirby Cole, walking in at 9:58 with her coffee and her professionalized smile, saw her there, and for exactly half a second her face did something. Then she put it away. She sat down. At 10 o'clock, Marcus stood at the head of the table. 2 years ago, he said, someone in this room began stealing from this company. I'm going to walk you through how, because every one of you approved budgets that made it possible without knowing it. And every one of you deserves to understand exactly what happened before we decide what happens next. He nodded to Priya Chandrasekaran, seated near the door, with a laptop and a folder thick enough that 2 board members visibly straightened in their chairs at the sight of it. Priya walked them through it: the shell vendor, the UPS mailbox, the 11-wire transfers, 41 minutes, one document at a time. And by minute 20, 3 people at the table had stopped looking at the screen and started looking at Vanessa Kirby Cole. By minute 30, 6 had. Vanessa did not move. Her coffee sat untouched in front of her, going cold, and she kept her face arranged in something close to polite concern, the same face she had used for 11 years to survive board meetings that went badly for other people. And then, Marcus said, when Priya finished, 9 days ago, this company promoted a night custodian named Amara Reeves into a management track because she found $500,000 sitting in a trash can and handed it back at 1 in the morning without being asked. He let that sit. Within 2 weeks, an anonymous, highly specific complaint accusing her of child neglect was filed with Fulton County, a complaint that included private details about her family that only someone she'd personally spoken with could have known. And her own timesheet records were digitally altered using a security badge issued under a fake vendor name, from a terminal in this building at 11:52 at night. He looked directly at Vanessa. That terminal was yours, Vanessa. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone in them is doing the same math at the same time, and none of them wants to be the first to say the answer out loud. Vanessa's coffee cup made a small sound against the table, as her hand, for the first time in 11 years that anyone in that room had witnessed, was not entirely steady. "I don't know what you think you found," she said, and her voice was still smooth, still professionalized. "But I would be very careful about making accusations you can't. The wire transfers went to an account under your sister's maiden name," Marcus said. "We have that too." She stopped talking. The board chair, a 70-year-old man named Whitfield's original co-investor who had known him since the box truck days, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Vanessa, is any of this not true?" She did not answer. He asked again. She looked finally at Amara, sitting quietly at the far end of the table in her navy dress with her hands folded, and something passed over her face that might have been shame or might only have been the calculation of a woman, realizing in real time that there was no version of this where she walked out of the room the way she'd walked in. "I want to speak with legal counsel," she said. "You can do that," Marcus said, "on your way out." Vanessa stood. She gathered her folder, her cup, the small remaining pieces of the composure she had spent 11 years building, and on her way past the far end of the table she stopped, briefly, in front of Amara. "I hope you understand," she said, low enough that only Amara could hear it, "that none of this was personal." Amara looked up at her, steady, unhurried, in no rush at all now that the rush had finally stopped mattering. "It was personal to me," Amara said. "It was my children. That's about as personal as it gets." Vanessa did not have anything to say to that. She walked out. The board voted 3 things that morning. To accept Vanessa Kirby Cole's immediate termination, effective before the meeting ended. To initiate a full independent forensic audit of every account she had touched in 11 years, and to refer the matter to the Fulton County District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit, along with everything Priya Chandrasekaran had compiled, including the falsified timesheet records and the digitally reconstructed evidence, tying the anonymous child welfare complaint back to information only Vanessa had been given directly, in a conversation Amara now remembered in exhausting, precise detail. Vanessa Kirby Cole left the building at 11:40 that morning. She did not look at Amara on her way out. Within 4 months, she surrendered her CPA license rather than face revocation. Within a year, federal prosecutors added wire fraud charges to the state case, and she pleaded to 18 months, most of it eventually served, plus restitution that would take her the rest of her working life to pay back in full. Fulton County Caseworker's Office received Priya's documentation the same afternoon. The neglect investigation was closed within a week, formally noted as unsubstantiated, and in an unusual addendum the supervisor added herself, initiated based on information now believed to have been deliberately fabricated by a third party. The caseworker herself, Denise Ollivant, called Amara personally to apologize, off the record, and told her something Amara would carry with her for a long time afterward, that she saw dozens of files a month that could have gone exactly this way, and that most of the mothers on the other end of them never got a chance to prove what Amara had just proven, simply because most of the mothers on the other end of them didn't happen to know a man who owned the building. Amara's timesheet was corrected. Her suspension was lifted with full back pay. Loretta received a personal letter of apology from the county, which she framed and hung in her hallway, not out of vanity, she said, but so nobody in that building ever forgot what has happened to a good woman over nothing but a lie. Amara was reinstated the following Monday. She did not go back to nights. She started that week in the office Marcus had promised her, learning the routing software properly this time, from the front of a conference room instead of underneath its table at 11 at night. Kai's speech therapy resumed on schedule, uninterrupted, because the benefits had never actually lapsed, only the fear that they might have been real. First week back, Loretta showed up at Amara's door with a dish she said she'd made too much of, which had become a habit of hers over the past year. Enough for 4 now, not because she miscounted but because 4 was the number she cooked for these days. She sat at Amara's kitchen table while Nia did homework and Kai drew at the counter, and she didn't say much about the 9 days that had just passed, because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the hallway outside apartment 3D. She just stayed for dinner the way she always did now and left the leftovers the way she always did now. And Amara understood, watching her go, that some kinds of family you don't get assigned. You build them, one plate of food at a time, across a hallway over years. 3 months later, in a session Amara watched from behind the glass, with her hand pressed against her mouth, Kai said his sister's name in a full, clear sentence for the first time in his life. Nia found out and cried harder than Kai did, which nobody had expected, and which became, for reasons nobody could quite explain afterward, the family's favorite story to tell at Thanksgiving for years to come. Devonte got a formal commendation in his personnel file, the kind that colleges like to see attached to a criminal justice application, and a letter of recommendation from Marcus Whitfield himself that he would frame and keep long after he made detective. He told the story of the badge ticket number so many times over the following year to so many different relatives at so many different holidays that his mother finally told him, laughing, that he was going to wear the memory out before he turned 25. He didn't care. He'd been the one who noticed. Nobody had ever taught him that noticing counted for anything until it turned out to matter more than almost anything else in the whole story. Priya Chandrasekharan's firm was retained permanently by Whitfield Logistics to conduct quarterly forensic reviews, a line item in the budget that Marcus insisted on personally, over the objections of 2 board members who felt it was an unnecessary expense now that the immediate problem had been resolved. Marcus told them, in the same flat tone he used for numbers that mattered, that the 400 people who worked in that building deserved better than a company that only looked closely at its own books after somebody had already been hurt. He also quietly instituted a policy, unannounced and buried in an internal memo almost nobody read carefully, requiring that any employee reporting an operational discrepancy through any channel be formally credited in writing, regardless of their title or department. A small procedural change that would have meant, 2 years earlier, that Amara's warehouse observation never sat in a drawer, unread for as long as it did. Julian, Marcus's son, asked Amara's name twice before he finally remembered it without checking his phone. It was a small thing. It did not undo years of never once having learned the names of the people whose labor the building ran on. But it was the beginning of something, the same way writing a name down once is sometimes the beginning of no longer being able to say you never knew it. Marcus asked Amara, 6 months later, on the porch of the Boulevard duplex on a warm evening with both children asleep inside, whether she would consider having dinner with him sometime that wasn't about operation schedules or benefits packages or anything at all except the 2 of them. She said she'd think about it. She said yes 4 days later. They took it slow because Amara told him, plainly, on their second real date, that she had spent her whole adult life being the only steady thing in her children's world, and she was not going to build something new on top of that unless it was built carefully, brick by brick, the way her grandmother had built the only thing she'd ever owned outright. He said that sounded right to him. He meant it. He met Nia and Kai properly a month after that at a Saturday breakfast that he was more nervous about than any board meeting he'd sat through in 30 years. And Kai, who did not hand out his words easily to strangers, looked at him for a long moment across a plate of pancakes and said, carefully, 1 syllable at a time, his name. Marcus did not say anything for a moment. He just nodded, and Amara watched him blink hard twice, and she did not tease him about it later, 'cause some things a person earns the right to keep private, even after you've watched them happen. 2 years after the night she found the envelope, Amara Reeves stood in a boardroom on the 30th floor of Whitfield Logistics, not as a guest this time, but as the company's newly appointed Director of Operations Integrity, a role created specifically in the aftermath of what everyone in the building now simply called, in hushed and slightly reverent tones, the Kirby Cole matter. Her job, among other things, was making sure nobody in that building ever again had the kind of unchecked access Vanessa had spent 2 years quietly abusing. She built the position from nothing. The same way she'd built a curriculum for Kai out of library books and index cards, when nobody with the actual authority to help her had bothered to look closely enough to notice he needed it. She still kept a refrigerator covered in drawings at home, though the apartment was bigger now, and the light came through the west-facing kitchen window, at an angle she'd chosen the place specifically for. Taped near the top of it, next to the speech words of the week, was a folded $20 bill in a small envelope. She still hadn't spent it. She'd stopped telling herself she was saving it for something specific. Some things you just don't spend, and you stop needing a reason why. Nia's old note was there too, the torn scrap that said, "I can watch Kai." I already do, though the tape had yellowed and the corner had started to curl, and Amara kept meaning to replace the tape and kept not getting around to it. Some nights, standing at that refrigerator after the children were asleep, Amara thought about the 9 days that had almost taken everything from her. She thought about how many other women in this city were living through some version of those 9 days right now, with nobody 30 floors up ever finding out about it at all. That thought didn't let her rest easy, and she'd stopped expecting it to. Okay, before you scroll away, let me be straight with you about this one. This story is fiction. Amara isn't real. Marcus isn't real. Vanessa isn't real. Whitfield Logistics isn't real. Though if it were, I imagine its lawyers would have a very long year ahead of them. A few things I put in on purpose that are real. Developmental speech delay and long Medicaid waitlists for pediatric therapy are very real, and they hit working-class families the hardest, because private therapy runs well over $100 a session and public options are often stretched thin for months or years. If this is something your family is dealing with, look into your state's early intervention program. Waitlists exist, but so do parent advocates who can sometimes help move things along. Corporate fraud through shell vendors and falsified invoices is also real, and it is often uncovered not by outside auditors, but by the people closest to the ground, the ones who notice a scheduling gap or a strange badge log, because they are the ones actually doing the work every single day. And the misuse of child welfare reports as a weapon against people who are inconvenient to someone with power is a real and documented pattern. Researchers who study the child welfare system have raised concerns for years about racial and economic disparities in who gets reported and investigated in the first place. It's a topic worth reading into directly if it affects you, rather than taking my word for the specifics. If you are a mandated reporter, or you ever find yourself on the other end of a report, please remember that the system exists to protect children, not to punish poverty, and that distinction matters enormously in practice, even when it gets lost on paper. If someone in your life is carrying more than they've ever said out loud, this is your reminder to ask, not because you'll always know what to do with the answer, just because being asked sincerely by someone willing to wait for the real one is sometimes the whole thing a person needed. Thank you for staying to the end.